Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the OIG Roundtable. The whole team is here. Glad to have everybody here for this week's discussion. As always, I've got Wade McFall, retired Assistant Special Agent in Charge from the LA Field Office, a member of our SIU investigative team, Matt Kachansky, retired executive from HHS OIG, the retired Northeast UPIC Director, and one of our managers on our SIU investigative team, and Jaysen Eisengrein, who was Matt's counterpart at HHS OIG and the Western UPIC Director, and now our Special Director in Charge working on special projects, process improvement, and the like. Today, we actually want to circle back and talk about some things that are actually in that world of process improvement. And really, I think we want to focus today talking about quality and quality process. For those that were at the ATC this past November and you attended and you stopped in, you saw myself and Tim Deneen from Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey. We did a presentation where we talked about high quality referrals and investigations that lead to high quality referrals. And there are a whole bunch of metrics that come into play, in that. But one important piece of the puzzle always starts internally with quality and quality process. And so, part of that is understanding where investigators need a little bit of a prop up. It's understanding where investigators know the things that they're doing and are left to their devices. And it really does start, it doesn't matter if it's the OIG or if you're at an SIU, it really does start from that process improvement perspective with case reviews and file reviews and being able to identify where cases should be jettisoned, where they should be closed, resources reallocated, and things of that sort. But the one thing that file reviews and case reviews can also do, provide some feedback on, are instances in which investigators might need some propping up. If you have investigators that are languishing, case reviews are going to ultimately show that, because you're going to find that if an investigator is not really documenting their cases or what have you, it could be because they are having a struggle with understanding the job. It could also be that they just don't understand all of the nuances of policies and things of that sort. So, Wade, I want to start with you because we'll take it from two perspectives. The first one is, as a supervisor at the OIG, file reviews were an integral part of the process, right? There was a 90-day case review policy that you would sit down and discuss cases with the agents and the investigators every 90 days, identify some areas for improvement, and find kind of the level set, right? You can't know, as the supervisor, you can't know every single case that every investigator is working on. If you're managing 8 or 10 investigators and they've got 8 or 10 or 15 cases, Wade McFall your brain can't operate enough to understand all those cases. But what are some of the things from a supervisor's perspective? What are some of the things that you're looking at or looking for when you're doing a case review?
I think in kind of the simplest form, the way to kind of explain the way I used to do it is you'd have a file review sheet that you'd fill out during the file review when you're discussing the case. What is the theory on the case? What are we charging? What do we need to do to prove those charges? Go through the whole thing, especially if it's a new case, basically the 101 of the case. But then that case file review sheet should have pretty much documented everything that we discussed as far as what had been done and what needs to be done. So then the next file review in 90 days, all those issues that were notated have to be kind of addressed. Either, check mark, yes, this interview is done, this was done, this wasn't done. If something wasn't done, there could be 20 different reasons why, but we discuss why did this not get done in the last 90 days. And it's, hopefully it's a legit reason that, it just didn't get around to it for a number of reasons. But if you take that file review sheet from the previous file review and kind of go like bullet points one by one and make sure that everything has been addressed. And then once you've gone over that to see what has been done and hasn't been done, you project what's going to be done over the next 90 days and have basically that file review sheet that you'll refer to on the next file review indicating all the things that need to be done. And that should spur some conversations too, as far as what are the options for the case. Every case could be worked a number of different ways. You might consider doing consensual monitoring. You might do some undercover work. Maybe you're just working towards a search warrant. There's probably dozens of different things that could be the next potential step. And that's a good point. After you've discussed what had been done the last 90 days, looking forward to the next 90 days, what are our options on, different investigative tools we want to use?
Yeah, and I think, and that transcends very smoothly from the OIG world into the SIU world, right? There should be there should be some formalized case review system in place where you've got a document that the investigator writes up for each case, and it doesn't need to be a novel, right? So at the OIG, we had date of file review, date of last file review, right? So you knew that you were doing these in 90-day increments, kind of the overview of the case, and then what has happened since the last file review, and what do you plan to do in the next 90 days? So you're kind of constantly updating your investigative plan. And it's not set in stone, it's not formal, but certainly that is something that from an SIU perspective should, can transcend easily. So now let's talk about that for a minute, because now, as someone who's kind of doing investigative work directly now and in the SIU space, the important thing, and I know that this was something that was an issue for you, is kind of transcending that mindset from the law enforcement mentality to the payment integrity mentality. But part of that is also that the policies of a different payer are going to be different. Now, here at Advise, one of the challenges that we have is that we do work for multiple payers. And so there may be an instance where you're working on multiple contracts. And so you have to understand, like, what are the nuances for those. But the general premise is cases continue to move one way or another as long as somebody is keeping track of that movement, right? And if you have an instance where you're not keeping track of a case or the case movement, that's where it becomes stale and it becomes stagnant. And I think that's where you also get into this whole issue involving what's an appropriate caseload, right? I mean, if you've got a caseload of 30 cases and all you're really doing is updating your case from the last update without actually moving it, you kind of get to a point where you've got to say, hey, this is just too much work, right? You've got to be able to either figure out a way to close cases, talk to somebody about reassigning cases, or then create front burner and back burner work, right? Because you've got to be able to kind of gauge how your day is going to go.
Yeah, and I think when you get a caseload of, 30 seems high to me. With the OIG, we are used to, somewhere around 10 to 15 cases. But having said that, you might have an agent that has one case. It might be some huge undercover operation or some huge civil case that is literally taking their 40-hour or their 50-hour week, and that's all they work on. So it depends on the case, the type of cases. But I do feel if you get too many in a row, 30, and I was talking to somebody from another MCO, and they were saying like 30 is like what a lot of the investigators had, but on the other side, on the commercial, they were carrying like 60 cases. And to me, that's just insane. Like you said, the only thing you can do there is try and get an update to the file every 30 days, and they're meaningless updates at that point, because it's just too much. And the whole, we've talked about this, you're supposed to try and do more with fewer resources, and it just doesn't work.
Right.
You have to have a manageable caseload, or you're just spinning your wheels and you're not getting anything done.
And part of that is also understanding what those external stakeholders need, right? So I know we harp a lot on this whole premise of the law enforcement liaison, but there really needs to be someone who can have conversations about what cases are interesting to whom, what, where, and why, right? Like I've talked about in New Jersey for a period of time, the chief of the healthcare unit at the time had very little interest. There was very little appetite for ambulance cases that weren't pretty straightforward fraud cases of, services not rendered. And I know we talk a lot about this, but you talk a lot about in California, the venue issue, right? Understanding the venue helps you understand who you're talking to, right? And that helps you understand if your case is going to have legs or not, and whether or not you're spinning your wheels going down a path. Because if you've got the venue, but you've got a prosecutor that's not interested, do you find venue somewhere else?
Yeah, and that goes back to the file review. The first file review in a case is open. That has to be the major kind of topic of discussion, is where are we going to get this prosecuted? Present it to our first choice has always been the U.S. Attorney's Office, and then we have different options within the district that we can go to the DA's office, a number of different areas. But you have to have that going down the right road, otherwise you're just wasting time. But there are options, and I've talked about this on some of the previous podcasts, but as far as the venue used to be concerned, we had, in the LA region, we had offices in Phoenix, in Hawaii, Las Vegas, San Diego, and some of those other offices didn't have quite the caseload that we had in Los Angeles. So if there was a case that I was looking at it with an agent in Los Angeles and they're saying like it really doesn't meet the U.S. attorney's either their dollar threshold or just their guidelines in general, basically get a declination from them and then pitch it somewhere else, either within the region at another prosecutor's office or, another, as long as we could get venues, and that could be as simple as one patient, one Medicare beneficiary who lives in Vegas. You literally could do it with one. The other thing that we did as in addition to kind of distributing some of those cases within our region, and this was worked through headquarters, but they hired a special assistant, a SAUSA, special assistant United States attorney, and placed him in, it was either North Dakota or South Dakota, worked out of the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that gave us venue there because the EOMBs, the Medicare benefit statements, and the checks were being cut from, I forget if it was one of the carriers or whoever.
Meridian, probably.
Yeah. Meridian, I think,
Right.
yeah. So that gave us venue in that state, whether it was North Dakota or South Dakota. And so we would work them with the SAUSA from there. And we would have agents from Los Angeles or Phoenix or wherever work the case with the SAUSA, and they'd have to travel there every once in a while. But really the only venue issue was documents were being produced there. So still the interviews and all the legwork, the investigative work was done either in Los Angeles or Phoenix or San Diego. But the fact that those checks were cut and those EOMBs were mailed from there gave us venue from there. And that was great because we had a SAUSA dedicated just to those cases. And we got a lot of productivity from that.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon. I mean, I know, Jaysen and I, when we were in New York, we would find a lot of times that if you had a case where the provider was in Brooklyn, we would bring the case, which is Eastern District of New York. We would bring the case to Southern District of New York because the Medicare contractor, who, at the time was the carrier or the MAC or whomever it was located in New York in Southern District. So you'd be able to get those kind of cases. The only caveat I'll put is that what we're not talking about is venue shopping. We're not saying like, you go to this district, they decline it. You go to this district, they decline it. That doesn't have a great look. What we're talking about is finding an appropriate venue based upon a combination of things that could include work share, volume, thresholds. If you know, for example, where Wade was, if you know that the Central District of California, which is LA, if you know that that Central District doesn't want a case that's below $1 million, but you're required to go get that declination, you go get that declination and bring it to another district and say, hey, they're not declining it for anything other than that. I mean, if you're working, the great example I like to give is if you're working an administrative case with OIG, for example, Office of Counsel to the Inspector General, and you're working on a civil monetary penalties law case, in order for OIG to send what's called the demand letter, which is the functional equivalent of a civil complaint, and the case is going to go to litigation, you have to have a declination by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And so, you would typically just do a simple email to the prosecutor and say, you're declining this case, and then you'd be able to bring it to your next level. So we're not talking about, going and shopping this venue after venue to a prosecutor who's not interested necessarily in the case. We're talking about bringing it where the venue is going to be something where the prosecutors are going to have the appetite because of work share, lower thresholds, and understanding that from kind of the beginning helps to set that tone on those workflows. During a file review, it helps to set that cadence. So, yeah. Matt, I want to go to you because part of this is also going to come back to understanding investigative steps. And, the example that I know we've been talking a lot about, we just did training yesterday for one of our SIU plans that we do work for. We talked a lot about in the training yesterday, sampling, statistical sampling, probe sampling, and we've talked a lot about it. We don't want to go too deep into it. I do refer people to Chapter 8 of the Program Integrity Manual. That's an important piece of the puzzle. It's the piece of the puzzle that instructs the UPICs and the MACs on how to do sampling. We follow the PIM because it's the standard, and we want to stay with that standard. But part of that in that quality is investigators understanding the basics of statistical sampling and probe sampling. No one is saying you got to understand the science behind it. No one is saying an investigator needs to understand what's the difference between a 90% confidence level, a 95% confidence level, stratifying samples and things of that sort, but understanding sort of the implications of whether you pick one or the other is going to be a piece of that puzzle that an investigator should know.
Oh, absolutely. And, the training we did yesterday and the training, we've done in the past really goes into this is what the investigators need to know. This is what the investigators need to do. And this is where they need to stay away from or work with a statistician to actually get the job done. Because to do a proper statistical sampling, you've got to work with the statistician to explain the case to the statistician, and the statistician can then lay out the options as to what the universe is, what the parameters are for whatever samples you want, the size, the type, and how that affects the case and its planning, all in line with what the allegations are and where you think that case is going. So it's got to be a conversation between the two. And that type of thought goes throughout the conducting of investigation, from the lead to resolution, where you've got to be working with your supervisor on the case reviews, with the data analysts that are providing you the data, with the medical review coders that are looking at the medical records. They've got to understand what the case is. You have to understand as an investigator what they're doing, so that they give you an informed coding review that that's relevant to the case itself. So
Right.
all of that type of planning has to be done in concert with all the operational arms within the SIU throughout the whole course of the investigation.
And one of the pieces of the puzzle I always suggest to our SIU clients is, look, if you've interviewed 5 members of your plan and you're making a request for records to the provider, even if that is a statistical sample of records and we're using a rat stats, minimum number sample size of 100, if those 5 people that you interviewed aren't part of that sample, request those extra records. You've already interviewed them. You've already gotten some background, some position, or some opinion from them. You would be remiss to not look at those 5 records. Now, while you cannot use those 5 records for the purposes of extrapolation, unless one or more of those are included in your statistical sample, it's certainly beneficial for you to be able to have a set of records that you can then interrogate through an audit in comparison to the interviews. And I think a piece of the puzzle that's often missed is that these are things that can work in parallel with each other. Your statistical sample of records or your probe sample of records should be separately identifiable from the list of records that you're going to request that are relative to interviews that you've done. If you've interviewed someone, you should get the records. Regardless of whether you're doing a probe sample or a statistical sample, you have to think in sort of 3 bucket terms. When is the statistical sample going to be appropriate? When is a probe sample going to be appropriate? And when is requesting records from the provider for people you've interviewed appropriate? And what you may find is that while a statistical sample may be appropriate, collecting the records for the people you've interviewed is always going to be applicable. If you're doing a probe sample, collecting those records for the people you've interviewed is always going to be applicable. You should always make sure that you've got, those 2 things covered, because they are going to be part of what that process is. And truthfully, you save yourself a lot of trouble from a time perspective by just doing it all at once. Now, I don't want to go off too far astray, but when we're talking about collecting records as part of that quality process, it should also include an attestation to the provider. You should never be, from an SIU perspective, you should never be requesting records from a provider that doesn't include an attestation where the provider acknowledges that they are sending you what they believe to be the cumulative record that's being asked for at the time it's being asked for. because what you don't want is a situation where in 6 months, when you've assessed an overpayment, that there's miraculously records that have been identified. Now, that may be an argument for later on in a hearing and an appeal and an ALJ, a district court, but certainly you want to be able to have the proper information in front of you to say, here's an attestation that the provider sent that said, no, they gave us everything. You've signed a piece of paper where you've said, I've given everything. So part of that quality and part of that process improvement is sort of understanding what is the totality of those circumstances when you get those records back. So it's just another piece of the puzzle. So Jay, I want to go to you kind of for the little bit that we have time left which is this whole discussion and how it ultimately evolves to what we don't want, which is something to devolve. And so part of that is mitigating the risk and having these checks and balances in place, the QA, but the checks and balances from a file review perspective, from that quality, it's all about mitigating risk from the payer's perspective.
So this discussion is really a consultation that would take several hours, and frankly, Advise can provide those consulting services and has, and it's helpful to the organization. So that's the down and dirty of it and the sales pitch, if you will. But this is about having a quality management system in your organization. The quality management system is based on a quality management plan. The quality management plan is consistent with the organization's goals. Are you looking for investigations that are going to yield a return on investment? Are you looking for ones that are going to, identify patient harm and other, high-level risks, or all of the above? So that then leads to a set of procedures that allow you to get to that, which in fact include everything that everyone has talked about, including here's a file review schedule. Now, I will say one thing about quality and assistance to people that need to move along. There's a concept in the medical community called inter-rater reliability, and that is, so not everybody needs a file review just every 90 days. That might be the minimum, but there might be somebody that's new or that's struggling with a concept or a new investigation or something that, is a change to what they've normally done, where you need to have some additional resources inserted. But anyway, so the quality management plan also includes identifying opportunities for process improvement. I guarantee you, and I'm not disparaging the situation at all, and I'm certainly concerned about it, being a resident of Maryland. I'm sure that the people that are in charge of maintenance on the Key Bridge are now looking for the emails about how they said, oh no, we really need to do this, that, and the other thing. So you don't want the situation to be traumatic for your organization, and then you're scrambling to figure it out, but rather have gone along looking for those significant risks, identifying them, and inserting opportunities for process improvement. Where there are failures, having a nonconformity, you need to document it. You need to develop a mitigation plan. It needs to be written down and then track to successful conclusion. Long and short of it is, as you said, Eric, it's risk management. It's a very tedious process, but it's one that up front may be tedious, but on the back end, it's just much easier for the organization and much less dangerous, frankly, for the organization's success.
Yeah, and I think, while we'll call it a tedious process, in today's world, excuse me, in today's world where documentation is all electronic, that process is a little less tedious than it was, years ago. I mean, we all remember, back in the day when we had 90-day file reviews and everything was in hard copy, and you'd get ready for your file review, and you'd go into the file room and you'd pull out a small shopping cart and you'd bring you'd bring all of your case files into your supervisor's office, and it was a day-long event in some cases, right? It'd be 4 or 5 hours of sitting through this. Now with electronic reporting and all of that, it's a little bit easier to get through that process, but one that, while it is tedious, it really does help to facilitate that ROI. Should SIUs have cases open for a year? In the OIG world, it was not uncommon for us to have cases open for a few years because the criminal investigative process is a slow process. You're waiting on things that you don't have control over, subpoenas, documents that come in from subpoenas, whatever it may be. Whereas in the SIU space, the cases can typically move a little bit faster because it's really, kind of a finite group of things that you're looking at. So, I think from the SIU perspective, I'm always thinking in terms of what are your metrics? If you have a case that's open for more than 12 months, what's the reason it's open for more than 12 months? Yeah, I think one of the number one reasons that cases wind up being open for more than 12 months, at least as an open case, is because there's some other organization involved, right? It's not in your control. And I think what winds up happening in the SIU space is that when control of a case is lost, the time tends to take a little bit longer. We saw that at the OIG when the case would go to the U.S. Attorney's Office and it was after a complaint or an indictment, the case started to move at a crawl because it was no longer your case anymore. And I think what always becomes the thing is that once a case gets sent over, it's not your case anymore, but you unfortunately become the collateral responsibility for having to deal with it. So a lot of those metrics of running timeframes, why are cases 12 months old? Why are they 18 months old? Heaven forbid you have a case that's 24 months old in the SIU space, but why is it that old? And is there enough in the file to document something to understand that if someone were to come in and try to understand from an ROI perspective, why does Wade McFall have a bunch of cases that are 24 months old? Wade can say, oh, because these cases are all with Mafuku, they're with, whomever, OIG. So those metrics become important. It doesn't take away from the fact that the quality still always needs to be there, right? You don't need to spin your wheels on a lot of junk, which will always get back to if you have tools in place that provide you with a greater level of work than you're able to do, the rubber has to hit the road. If you've got, for example, an analytic tool that's pumping out 30 cases a month for leads, and you don't have the ability to vet those leads, you have paid for an analytic tool that's doing nothing to help you, right? There's a balance that has to be met. If you're digesting every single lead that comes in and you're vetting every single lead as if it's a viable case, you're spinning your wheels. There has to be that ability, which gets you back to the premise of quality investigations, quality documentation, and cutting through the fat to keep things moving. So yeah, we could spend hours talking about the importance of file reviews, ensuring that your cases are being documented properly to find out where you're going. But even just from that investigative process, like the fact that we learned yesterday when we do a lot of the training that the investigators really didn't have as strong of a handle of understanding probe and statistical sampling. And I don't mean the nuances of it, but the probative value of doing statistical sampling and probe sampling, with the caveat that in some states, we know of at least a couple of states on the Medicaid side where statistical sampling cannot be done, right? The edict was put out. It's got to be actual. So at that point, do you do probe sampling? Do you just do a larger sample of records? You have to know that. Whatever your SIU area is, you have to know what those state requirements are to know if you do statistical sampling and you extrapolate and it's not able to be used in the state, you've just wasted a ton of time, effort, money, and energy that you shouldn't be spending. So it's these nuances that are really important. Line investigators don't need to know, obviously, the full nuances, but as a line investigator, if you're thinking about statistical sampling and you're working in a state that doesn't allow it, get that out of your head, right? It's just investigator 101 for that region, for that plan that you're in. So tons of stuff to talk about in this. We never seem to have enough time. And there's always more things to talk about than time. So as always, thanks to everybody who tunes in. Again, if you're not getting the newsletter, hello at advize, health.com. You can get our newsletter every Friday in your inbox. For those of you that are following us on LinkedIn, you're seeing some stuff. We've got a new website that's coming out in a couple of weeks. We've been sending some teasers, entirely refreshed. If you're not following us on LinkedIn, please go to our page on LinkedIn and follow us so you can see all of our new content, including our newsletter, the OIG Roundtable, all the invites to our LinkedIn Lives. We've got some great LinkedIn Lives coming up. We've got coming up in April the case of US v. Paulus, where I am moderating a discussion involving two of the lawyers that worked on Dr. Paulus's criminal defense. Come May, we're going to be doing a great LinkedIn Live with two of our subject matter experts, both from the investigative and the auditing side on behavioral health. Everybody knows that's a hot topic, so we're going to be talking about that from the investigative perspective and from the coding and auditing and documentation perspective with two of our great subject matter experts. We got a lot coming up in the next couple of months. So as always, Wade, Matt, Jayson, as always, good to see you guys. And we'll see everybody on the next OIG Roundtable.